I'm Brent Henderson. I think I know almost everyone here, with a few exceptions. But I'm assistant professor in linguistics department. And I'm going to do something a little bit different, maybe a little ambitious today, and try to give, in a way, two talks in the same hour here. So for the first half, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the language, which will be the thing that ties both of those talks together, Chimwiini. But having these sort of two topics within the same session also kind of reflects the work that I'm trying to do here, which is to do documentation work on an endangered language and also looking at factors that go into the endangerment of that language, but also trying to do linguistic analysis and interesting theoretical work at the same time. Today, as far as the documentation goes, I don't have documentation outcomes to present to you since it's a fairly new project. Those are all still kind of in process, but we will talk a little bit about the project. But what I want to do is talk for a little bit about the language itself, introduce the language to you. It's a brief history of it, and talk about some of the factors that went into its endangered status. This little thing seems to have a very limited range. Well, we'll just press the button. There we go. So we'll talk, introduce a brief profile of Chimwiini. We'll talk about its endangered status. I'll very briefly talk about the documentation project that's getting underway now. And then for the second half of our session here, we'll switch to the handout, and I want to talk about non-finite complements in Chimwiini, and specifically infinitive verbs and overt subjects with those verbs. And so we'll look at what Chimwiini can tell us about how infinitive verbs and gerunds work. So again, it seems like two very different topics, but sort of reflects the kind of work that I've been trying to do these days. So first we'll start with a brief history of Chimwiini. And I'll always, most of the time, call it Chimwiini because that's what the people who speak it tend to call it. But in the literature, it's known as Chimwiini. So I put that into the title because I want people to be able to find the work. But it's also known as Bravanese or Barawa or Chimbalazi or Chimbalezi. And it's the language of just one town, the town of Brava, also known as Mini or Mwini or Barawa, which is a single city in southern Somalia on the coast there. In fact, the word Chimwiini actually means language of Mini, and the word Mini just means town. So the name of the town is town, and it's the language of the town. It's part of the network of Swahili city-states that grew up on the East African coast, and we'll hear a little bit more about that during the end of the first millennium. And the town itself would seem to be probably roughly around 1,000 years old, maybe even a little bit older. And it's very likely that some Bantu language has been spoken there continuously for all that time. It's unlikely that there's been more than 25,000 or so speakers at any point in its history. And that in itself, sort of, as we'll see, and other factors as well, sort of raise the question of how did the language survive so long, right? And so that's another thing that I want to look at today. Here's a map of the East African coast, and what's laid out for you here in red is basically the Swahili communities, Swahili cultural reaches. And all of these, many of these little towns here are what I was talking about before, the old Swahili city-states. You can find Brava way up here. You can see that it's the northernmost and by far the most isolated of all the Swahili languages. In many of these places, this is all the domain of Swahili, and many of these places have their own dialects, some very similar to one another, some very divergent. The Swahili that's spoken out here in the Comoros and Madagascar is mostly unrecognizable to people who come from the interior of Tanzania, for instance. Bravanese Swahili Chimwiini is very much the same way. There's no ethnologue entry for Chimwiini. It's just listed as a dialect of Swahili. But most Swahili speakers from Tanzania and interior Kenya would not be able to understand Chimwiini. It's had very little contact with other Swahili cities for the past 300 years or more. And it's completely surrounded. You might wonder, well, what's spoken here in between Brava and these other places? And it's completely surrounded by Cushitic-speaking pastoralists, mostly speaking Somali and related languages like Afmai Tuni languages all spoken in there. So this really raises a question, in particular, with its low number of speakers, how has Brava sort of lasted in this environment, isolated environment for so long? Yeah, so how with so few speakers has it remained so stable for so long? And then what led to its strongly endangered status today? The second question turns out to be very easy to answer. The first question is a little more challenging, but I think in all of my interviews and stuff with Chimwiini, I'm getting a picture of how that might have happened. To explore that a little bit, we have to know a little bit about the history of the Swahili city-states, which again grew up toward the end of the first millennium, and were all of these little cities along the East African coast. They were all independent from one another, mostly politically, but shared a common language, common culture. And that was an urban culture, which separated them from most of the interior of the East African coast. They may have started off as fishing and agricultural communities, but very soon shifted to a trade and artisan-oriented economies, and especially this economy being seafaring traders. The reason for that is demonstrated on these maps here, so it's a little difficult to see maybe from where you are, but the red arrows going up the coast here represent the monsoon winds that prevail in July and in the summer months, whereas the blue winds prevail in January, and these winds just reverse themselves every year. So an economy grew up with Swahili traders and also Arabian and Indian traders using these monsoon winds once a year to travel back and forth. And so there was tons of international trade that's been going on for 1,500 years or more between the East African coast and the South Arabian Peninsula and India. And the Swahili were very much the ones who sort of controlled the sea trade in this area. Brava became a major coastal port along with Mogadishu and Merka and Kismayo to a lesser extent in medieval times, so around 1300 or so. Very important trading post in these waters. We have some information from that time from Ibn Battuta, the famous African traveler who visited Brava and Mogadishu and wrote about it as being very thriving, large thriving cities, right, big for that time. We can't go into too much detail about the structure of these Swahili city-states, but it's very interesting that even though there was very little political unity between them, they all had common culture and a sort of common structure to their societies. And very often what you find is that there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between what we might call city groups or families who dwelled in the immediate city center, and then groups that kind of surrounded the city, which had more connections to the interior and supplied the city with a lot of staples, things people needed to survive. This was also the case in Brava and remained the case until very, very recently. Two major, what we might call city groups, the Hatimi and the Bida. These are the people who consider themselves to be, and are considered to be kind of the true Brava, live mostly in those white coral houses in the middle of the city, and speak Chimwiini as their first language. Then there are 5 surrounding groups called the Shangamas, which is Somali for 5 clans, the Dafarad, Wairile, Hajua. These are known as the rear guard, because they came from the interior, and the Daktira and Goigal, the 2 of the shore who came up, migrated up the southern shore. Most of these groups speak a Tuni dialect, so a Cushitic language, as a first language, and they live sort of all around the exterior of Brava, but many of them also live inside the city. And if they live inside the city, they typically also speak Chimwiini, if not as one of their first languages, then as a language that they've learned growing up